I've always pushed and pushed and pushed and failed and failed and failed, and then some success, and then more pushing and more success and more failure. And in the grand scheme of things, I have one notch more hope than I do shame.
A lot of times when you think about achievement, people only see the end result. They don't see the 20 years, the 30 years of toiling in obscurity or trying and failing and learning from the failure and then trying something different.
From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. It's our show about work on our own terms. I've got a real treat of an episode for you today. Today's show is about the long game. It's about discipline and creativity, love, growth, but mostly it's about gardening. I have two very special guests in the studio today, the power couple, Roxane Gay and Debbie Millman. Now, both of these women have been in the studio before. In fact, they're responsible for a couple of our most popular episodes. Debbie Millman brought us the vision exercise that we return to almost every January 1st. She is a designer and a writer and a teacher. She's host of Design Matters, which is a podcast that has been around since long before I really understood what the word podcast was. She's the founder of the Masters in Branding program at the School of Visual Arts. Roxane is also a writer and also a teacher, a professor, and she's a cultural critic. She helps shape how we think in society about so many things like body image and race and work, to name just a few. These two women have an incredible love story. They met in 2018, moved in together in 2020, and not long after, married. And the book that they're sharing with us today, it's called Love Letter to a Garden. Most of the beginning of the book, which is so delicate and wonderful, it fits right in the palm of your hand. It's stories that Debbie tells about, frankly, being a pretty bad gardener on the way to becoming an excellent gardener. In other words, stories about growth. And then, I guess just to delight us, Roxane adds at the end her recipes. Recipes mostly consisting of things that she's figured out how to make from what Debbie has grown. Now, this book can be read literally for any gardeners in the house, but it's also a wonderful metaphor. It explores what it means to live a creative life, and for that life to unfold slowly over time. It's about how many times you have to fail until you get to something that works. We only ever remember the hits, the standouts, the things that make us loads of money and get us lots of attention. But truly, life is a learning process. And when lived at its best, it's a creative process. That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into it.
I'm not an accomplished gardener. I am on a quest to be a better gardener. And it's taken me a really long time to have any real success in the garden, mostly because for most of my adult life, I was trying to have a garden in Manhattan, which isn't really the most conducive place, and didn't really have any genuine success until I tried to start my garden in Los Angeles.
A number of things came from you in Los Angeles, and that can't be an accident, right?
No, it can't be.
Yeah. So, Roxane, Los Angeles, if I'm right, is where you lived.
It is where I lived. In August of 2018, I bought my house in Los Angeles, and I moved in a week before I met Debbie.
So much fell into place during this window of time for the two of you in 2018. Each of you personally, your new home owner, sort of laying down the roots. Do you believe in magic?
I do.
Yeah.
For sure. Big time.
So how do you think about this period in your life as a couple?
I think of it as a miracle. Debbie had been communicating with me for more than a year, reaching out first to be on her podcast, and then just because she enjoyed Hunger and wanted to share with me what she thought about the book.
And Hunger was that incredibly moving memoir that you wrote?
Yes. And so eventually she met a mutual friend who indicated that she should shoot her shot. And so she actually shot her shot. And I didn't Google her. I didn't know who she was. I don't listen to podcasts. So when I met her at the launch of Best American Short Stories 2018, when I did the signing line, I looked at everyone and was like, is this her? Would I want to date her? Would I want to, And Debbie was the last person in line. And I was like, oh, thank God.
Intentionally.
And I was like, yes, I could definitely go out with her. And so we went on a date and the relationship blossomed. And her persistence was really, it was like the first time I was actively pursued. And I actually didn't trust it because I was like, what's the catch here? But she was very persistent. And if you had like sort of reached out to God and written a wish list of what you would want in someone to spend your life with, she's exactly what I would have written down. And so to have that happen at 44, when I had already sort of started giving up and just thinking this is as good as it gets, it was magical.
And Debbie, I'm curious, and this will come back to the book. Just
Sure, absolutely.
stay with me on this
I
one.
can talk about Roxane forever.
I'm curious, up until that point in your life, what did love mean to you, and how did meeting Roxane shift that?
Well, love had been complicated. I am in my 60s now, and I didn't come out until I was 50. I'm of a generation that I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And by the 80s, it was really dangerous to be gay. And I also had a lot of my own homophobia given the way I was brought up and the culture at the time and how gay people were treated. Plus, I had gone through so much of my own childhood trauma that any more being different than my friends felt too dangerous for me. And even though deep down I suspected this about me, I didn't really feel safe enough and confident enough to do anything about it until I was much older. And so being gay, but being in straight relationships, you can get a sense of
It never worked for me.
And I was with some really lovely people. And I look back at that time of my life and feel a little bit ashamed because some of the people were really kind and others not so much. Up until coming out, I was never particularly good at love. My dog Duff taught me to open my heart and love unconditionally, which was the first time I did that. And then when I came out, it became a little bit easier. But until Roxane, it wasn't fully easy. And it's been 7 years now. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. And we talk about what it means to work at a relationship, but neither of us feel it's particularly work. It's just something we enjoy doing because we're also best friends and we're also soulmates and we're also everything.
How profound. And how amazingly well this circles back to the book that you have written and you have contributed to.
Yes.
Because as I read it, Love Letter to a Garden is a story, Debbie, about how you came to something you'd always tried before and found a new ease and creativity in it, and that's gardening.
I love that connection of ease and ease, yeah.
And how you, Roxane, embarked in a creative partnership and said, well, if you're going to learn to garden, I shall learn to cook. I was very curious if you actually cooked beforehand because it sure seemed like you knew what you were doing when you described what you were making.
Yeah, she just hadn't cooked with things that we picked from a garden together.
Correct. And like having to just sort of wing it. I'm not much of an improviser. When I moved to Charleston, Illinois to teach at Eastern Illinois University many years ago, I was a vegetarian and there weren't many options in terms of the restaurants. Like oftentimes they interpreted vegetarian as French fries and iceberg lettuce, which delicious. But
no meat.
Correct. See, exactly. So I knew I was going to have to figure out how to cook if I was going to eat something other than those two items.
Yeah.
And so I started to teach myself how to cook. And I had never known because my mom always was very resistant to teaching me how to cook because she didn't want me basically, spending my life cooking after some man. And I was like, no worries. But I learned. And then when Debbie created this garden, it's one thing to watch someone planting and nurturing, and she would go out there and water and put so much time in, and then she would prune and deadhead things, and I was learning what these things were. But then when it starts to bear fruit, it's incredible because you're like, wow, this really is how like circle of life stuff is happening.
Yeah.
And so it was a real pleasure to take her produce and try and make something worthy of all of the effort she had put into this garden.
And I'm also somebody that felt like these living things couldn't be wasted.
Yeah.
And we got a lot of tomatoes.
Oh,
And
so
so Roxane also made sauces and things that could continue the life of these beautiful things that,
I made ketchup from scratch.
yeah,
Wow.
My ketchup is amazing, I will
it is
say.
amazing.
I also loved the way that gardening stood in for generally understanding something about a creative process. And here I think about the beginning of the story and how sad I felt as a reader when you, I'm going to get the details wrong, but the pink little berries that you collected and that you
Yes.
had this great vision for. And then you learned that they were poisonous. And then your mother threw them out.
I remember being sad that she threw it all away, but it didn't deter me. I continued to try to make perfume from rose petals and talcum powder, baby oil. The roses smelled so pretty and so beautiful to me that the idea of being able to make rose perfume just kept me trying, similar to the gardening.
So then actually this is the story of trying and trying and trying. And
That's
yet,
the story of my life, Jess. That's the story of my life.
okay, that feels so universal. And so the piece I'm most interested in focusing on is the unlock. Like what changed for you that made you feel like you could do it?
Something that I learned about myself when I was being interviewed by Brene Brown. I was interviewed by her a couple of years ago, and this is way before gardening. She asked me what kept me continually trying in the face of repeated obstacles. And the only thing I could think of was that in the grand scheme of my life, because I've always pushed and pushed and pushed and failed and failed and failed, and then some success, and then more pushing and more success and more failure. And in the grand scheme of things, I have one notch more hope than I do shame. And so for whatever reason, I don't know if it's in my genetic makeup, I don't know if it's my psychological makeup, but even when I fail, I still have hope that someday, somehow, I might succeed. It kept me chasing Roxane for a year. It kept me working in my career for the first 15 years of what I call experiments in rejection and failure and humiliation. It's kept me doing the podcast, even though the first 4 years are unlistenable. It's kept me just continuing to try in the hope that there might be a better outcome.
I love that.
And what she's leaving out is that she has an incredible work ethic. It's not magic. And a lot of times when you think about achievement, people only see the end result. They don't see the 20 years, the 30 years of toiling in obscurity or trying and failing and learning from the failure and then trying something different. You have to just be so repetitive oftentimes to get good at something and to really thrive.
Well, I actually want to unpack this idea of work ethic with you both a little bit because I think that this is a career podcast. We talk a lot about work, and work exists within a capitalist structure. A lot of people rely on it to pay the mortgage, to pay the rent. And in today's career parlance, we have, in my mind, for too long celebrated the grind, the hustle, work harder, harder, harder. And it strikes me that that is not what you're talking about. And I wonder if you might think a little bit, each of you, about the grind versus work.
I think I'm going to actually make a distinction between the grind and time. because I've never hit it out of the park right away, and I'm not an overnight sensation, and I never will be. I expect things to take a long time. My career unfolded very slowly and then expanded as I was older. I don't really think I achieved any modicum of real success until I was late 30s into my 40s. I didn't start the podcast till I was 44. And I expect things to take a long time. I don't expect anything to go quickly. And so when I'm starting a project, I know it's going to be a commitment. Now, initially in my career, I would say that part of my work ethic stemmed from feeling like I needed to accomplish something in order to have meaning in my life, in order to be worthy of being alive. Productivity was associated with meaning. And to some degree, that still is the case, but it's really been taken over by wanting to find purpose and meaning in what I do. Especially as I've gotten older, especially as I now really have to think about the decisions in priorities and doing the things that I've always said I've wanted to do, or admit that they're not as important as I thought they were, that the dream was more important than the reality. And so I am actually confronting that.
How do you think about work ethic?
Well, I'm the child of immigrants, and I was raised by a workaholic, and my parents were very intense in how they raised us to be excellent. And you couldn't even bring home an A-. And so that was challenging, but for better and worse, it instilled in us a relentless work ethic. And that's why both of my siblings and I have achieved a fair amount of success. And that has been interesting. And what's interesting now is that we see this valorization of the hustle and the grind. And that's not necessarily a work ethic. That's a sort
compensation.
of, or a success ethic. It's what people think they need to do to be seen as working hard. And also what they think they need to do to achieve different kinds of success.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily wrong. But I really don't think you have to grind yourself into the ground. I don't think that you do your best work when you're doing 80, 90 hours a week of work.
Yeah.
When we know and studies show that you're most productive in stints of like 4 to 5 hours. It's not to say, of course, that the workday is going to become 4 to 5 hours, but most people can look at what they do during the workday and be honest and say that not all 8 or 9 hours of that workday are spent doing anything genuinely productive and propulsive. And so I have really, as I get older, I'm trying to figure out, how do I work better, not necessarily longer? When you are marginalized in the professional workplace, you oftentimes do actually have to grind, and you do have to hustle, and you do have to be visibly doing these things in order to get a fraction of the recognition of your white peers or your heterosexual peers or whatever. And so that is always something on my mind as well. Like when I look at the amount of work that I have to do to achieve any kind of parity with my peers, it's really frustrating. When I look at like the number of books that I've published and where I'm at in terms of like what I can command on the market versus people who have written 0, 1, or 2 books, it can be just enraging. And that also makes it that actually drives me even further and makes me think, well, okay, I'll show you. But like at the end of the day, who am I really harming and who am I showing? Like my wife, because no one else sees it.
I think it would be interesting for you to talk a little bit about what you learned writing the column for the New York Times for Workfriend, because your last column, your goodbye column, when you finished your stint there, I think was really profound in the way that you talked about what we owe our work and what our work may or may not owe us.
Well, yes, thank you, Debbie.
You're welcome.
I did write the Workfriend column for about 4 years for the New York Times, and I actually really enjoyed it because it was one of the more unexpected career turns. And the majority of the questions were, how can I quit my miserable job? And unfortunately, very few people have the financial freedom to be able to actually do so. But one of the key things I really wanted to impart to my letter writers is that the job is not going to ever love you. Your corporation is never going to be truly loyal to you because they are always serving their own bottom line. And if they're a public company, they're serving shareholder interests. If you work for a family restaurant and all of your bosses are related, they're always going to choose each other before they ever offer you any consideration. And so I always want people to make professional choices that reflect an understanding that you can kill yourself at work and they will be more than happy for you to die there. They will just extract as much labor as humanly possible. And yes, we live in a capitalist world. It is what it is for now. But you have to really ask yourself, what do I think this self-sacrifice is going to bring about for me? And I hope that more people start to realize, especially looking at what's happening in the world right now, that these companies are not loyal.
No.
When an organization can lay off tens of thousands of people without blinking.
Right.
Or the government.
Well, that was the organization I was referring to. You're right. They're horrible.
Roxane, I'm just going to say, I feel like you are reflecting so much of what we here in our community speak about. And the one place where I feel like we focus our energy is on where we actually have agency. Too many of us want it from the wrong places. There is real agency in any life.
There is.
And I feel like both of you in separate ways speak to the agency that we can all have.
One thing that I have learned, and don't always do, and actually very rarely do because of my own fears, is ask for what you want.
Yeah.
It's been very, very rare that someone has just said, here, do this. And so most of my life has been trying to get the courage up to ask for things. And sometimes it's been really scary. I remember back when I was at Sterling, I had it in my offer letter that I could earn shares based on my success. And 2 years later, I was really successful. We moved into the Empire State Building, and I wanted my shares. I felt like I'd earned them. And the partners at the time were a little skittish about awarding me my shares. And for the first time in my life, I said, well, if I don't get them, I'm going to have to leave. I don't know where that courage came from. I went home that night and crawled into bed with my clothes on, weeping, thinking, I love this job. What if they say, sorry? And thankfully they didn't. And I started to earn my shares over the next 2 decades. But it was terrifying to do that. And I really worried that I might lose the best job I ever had.
This idea of courage brings me back to what you said earlier about shame and hope and how critical it is to have just that much more hope.
Yeah. But I don't know where that came from. I don't know where that courage came from. It was almost as if something was conjured up in me to say this to the senior partner.
Courage is always what we talk about after the fact, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard you say that.
Well, I mean, I think this is something I actually learned from Danny Shapiro, who, when I was obsessing over what it meant to figure out, to sort of deconstruct what it meant to have confidence, that she was like, oh, confidence is overrated.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, I think it's more important to have courage to step into the unknown. And then I became really, really determined to deconstruct what confidence was. And confidence is really just the successful repetition of any endeavor. And that's what gives you the confidence. You don't get confidence. You can conjure the courage to then work towards confidence, but confidence isn't something you can pull off a shelf.
No. Would that you could,
Right?
Yeah. So before we finish our time together, I want to come back to the book, and I want to look at the context in which this book finds us. Many of us are feeling so externally fragile in a society, in a culture, in a business world that seems to be reconstituting itself in ways that we can't imagine. The only solace I find personally from it is that I remember just how bad humans are at telling the future. And so I think, well, whatever I'm afraid of, I at least know it's not going to be that, because I'm very bad at telling what the future is.
Yeah.
Against that backdrop, it feels relevant to pick up something new and to learn it in collaboration with someone. And I was just wondering if that was on your minds as you launched this book into the world.
Well, when I first was offered the opportunity to do this, they didn't say, oh, and by the way, can you ask your wife to include recipes? For me, it felt like a wonderful way to share what we had grown together. Because while I was out in the garden, Roxane was in the kitchen. And it felt that this story deserved that. And when I first asked Roxane if she would be interested in doing that, she balked at it a bit. You were not thrilled with the idea of creating recipes based on the things that you made. And
Well, it's not that. I would be thrilled to do anything with Debbie. It was more that this garden is hers, and she worked so hard and for so long. She would like the way she attacked that garden, the way she attacks everything. She was out there for hours. She would come in like covered in dirt, and I would just be like, up to your bathroom. And I didn't want to give them false impression that like I had participated in this gardening. I didn't want to take credit for something I hadn't done. Yeah. It was very easy and very joyful to cook food from the produce that she created. I just didn't want to take credit I didn't earn. And, I have all of the attention I could want, and quite frankly, more. And so I just wanted the book to reflect that she is the one who made this garden. So it wasn't a reluctance to create recipes at all.
Well, if we hadn't been together and I somehow magically was able to find a spot in New York City where I could actually successfully grow vegetables, I'd have been that person on the sidewalk with a table that said, take this free, because I wouldn't know how to make a sauce or ketchup or a strawberry tall cake or a tomato galette and all the beautiful things that she was able to make. Plus, I really just loved working with Roxane.
Yes.
I just feel like we click.
That was Debbie Millman and Roxane Gay. Debbie's new book, which Roxane contributes to, is called Love Letter to a Garden. Definitely check it out, folks. It was so wonderful to have them in the studio. I love that little nugget of truth Debbie offers up about hope and shame, that all we really need here is for our hope to be just a little bit bigger than our shame when we're going into creative acts, creating something new. Sounds easier than it actually is, but I know we can all do that. And then, of course, there's Roxane, who comes in with the pragmatic. Roxane points out that hope is not enough. We need work ethic, and she models that work ethic. It's about writing every day, mostly in silence and solitude. Craft is about practice. Finally, I had forgotten that Roxane authored the Work Friend column for so many years in the New York Times. I loved reading Roxane on work. And that point that she made in her final column, it's a point that I want to remind you of today as we part. Work isn't going to love you back. Make sure that you save your best creative energy for your biggest goals, and make sure that those goals are in alignment with your values, that they have to do with your family, the people you love, the things that you care about. And yeah, if work is among them, great. But don't make work the point. Now, if this episode resonated with you, I want you to send it to the gardener in your life. And by that, I don't mean the person digging in the backyard at your house. I mean the person who helps you tend your own creative soil. All right, folks. Let's talk more about this week's episode and everything else at office hours this week. We will get together on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, just as we always do. We being, of course, our senior producer, Sarah Storm, and myself. If you're trying to find us, you can always go to the LinkedIn news page on LinkedIn, or you can check our show notes. We always have a link in our show notes. I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. Thank you so much for coming to the studio today. We will be right back here next week.